Sehr verehrte Frau Staatsrätin, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Panel-Teilnehmerinnen und Panel-Teilnehmer, Teilnehmerinnen der Konferenz, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren zu Hause am Livestream. Ich darf Sie alle ganz herzlich zur Veranstaltung des Hamburg-Vigoni Forums, dem großen Auftakt unserer Vorlesungsreihe, begrüßen. Um die Zukunft Europas als Rechts- und Wertegemeinschaft sollte es von Seiten des Hamburg-Vigoni Forums lange vorbereitet heute Abend gehen. Wie drängend und ganz anders sich diese Frage angesichts der dunkelsten Stunde, die Europa seit 1945 erleben muss, stellen würde, an diesem historischen 24. Februar 2022, das hätte bei der Begründung des Forums vor mehr als 2 Jahren niemand von uns auch nur erahnen können. Die erste große Hamburger Rede zu Europa sollte eine Tradition begründen. Herausragende Persönlichkeiten der europäischen Politik an die Universität Hamburg einzuladen, um im Zwiegespräch zwischen Wissenschaft und Politik der Frage nachzugehen, was an Goethe angelehnt Europa in seinem Innersten zusammenhält. Einen besseren Redner als den lettischen Staatspräsidenten Egils Levits hätten wir uns nicht vorstellen können, zumal er ein Hamburger Student zunächst der Chemie, dann der Rechtswissenschaften und der Politikwissenschaft, als Alumnus seiner Alma Mater seit langem verbunden ist. So Sie die Medienberichterstattung verfolgt haben, verfolgen konnten, wissen Sie, dass Präsident Levits schon gestern in Hamburg angekommen war und von unserem ersten Bürgermeister, Herrn Tschentscher, empfangen wurde. Nach dem Angriff Russlands auf die Ukraine in den frühen Morgenstunden dieses 24. Februar musste er, was wir alle mehr als verstehen können, vormittags abreisen. Präsident Levits bedauert zutiefst, heute Abend nicht bei uns sein zu können. Er lässt Sie alle hier im Saal und zu Hause an Ihren Laptops, Computern und Bildschirmen herzlich grüßen und hat fest zugesagt, seine Rede zu einem anderen, einem glücklicheren Zeitpunkt nachzuholen. Wir hoffen, dass dieser glücklichere Zeitpunkt bald kommen möge und danken Präsident Levits von ganzem Herzen für diese Bereitschaft. Wir haben heute Morgen natürlich einen Augenblick darüber nachgedacht, angesichts der sich überstürzenden Ereignisse die Veranstaltung abzusagen, diesen Gedanken aber rasch verworfen. Wenn nicht jetzt, wann sollte sich Wissenschaft und Politik gemeinsam die Köpfe darüber zerbrechen, wie Europas Zukunft gestaltet werden? Was Europa als Rechts- und Wertegemeinschaft stark vereint, geschlossen und entschlossen der imperialen Anmaßung des russischen Präsidenten entgegensetzen kann, ohne dabei sein Credo vom Frieden in Freiheit aufzugeben. Will Wissenschaft sich nicht im Elfenbeinturm intellektueller Glasperlenspiele gemütlich einigeln, so darf sie sich heute nicht wegducken, selbstbescheidend wissen, wie gering ihre Gestaltungsmacht in Rebus Politicis ist, aber selbstbewusst mahnend, dass ohne wissensfundierte Politik die liberale Demokratie, Fake News, Verschwörungsmythen, totalitären Allmachtsfantasien und dreister Geschichtsklitterung, Geschichtsverfälschung wenig entgegenzusetzen hätte. Stalin soll einmal höhnisch gefragt haben, wie viele Divisionen denn der Papst habe. Vor den Divisionen der Wissenschaft wird Präsident Putin gewiss keine Furcht haben. Er sollte aber um die Stärke einer freien Wissenschaft wissen. Sie hilft Täter zu enttarnen, die sich zu Opfern machen. Sie hilft Aggressoren zu entlarven, die sich zu Friedensbringern stilisieren. Es geht ihr ganz im Sinne Humboldts um eigenständige Wahrheitssuche. Wer die Wahrheit eher in Glaubens- als in Wissenssphären verortet, sei an anderes erinnert. Gott sieht die Wahrheit, auch wenn er lange Jahre schweigt. Keine Sorge, wir wollen uns nicht ins Theologische versteigen. Dieser Satz, den ich gerade zitiert habe, ist im Übrigen weder ein frommer Wunsch noch eine aggressive Drohung des Westens, sondern der Titel einer Kurzgeschichte von Leo Tolstoi. Auf Russisch besonders lesenswert. Am heutigen Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und bei unserem morgigen Workshop müssen wir zweierlei zusammendenken. Das Hamburg-Vigoni Forum will Forschung, Politik und Zivilgesellschaft zur Zukunft Europas miteinander ins Gespräch bringen. Ganz wie es auch die Konferenz zur Zukunft Europas tut. Dabei geht es uns weniger um tagespolitische Detailfragen, als vielmehr um ein integrationspolitisches Gesamtkonzept und die dafür relevanten 3 großen Narrative: Raum, Souveränität und Identität. All das ist heute mitnichten obsolet geworden, im Gegenteil. Unter Beteiligung international renommierter Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler und insbesondere auch des wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchses möchte das interdisziplinär angelegte Forum praxisorientierte Vorschläge für die zukünftige Gestaltung des europäischen Integrationsprozesses erarbeiten und Politik und Gesellschaft unterbreiten. Gleichzeitig sollen die Überlegungen gemeinsam weitergedacht und in den öffentlichen Diskurs eingespeist werden. Und das Zweite, meine Damen und Herren, ist dann eben doch die Tagespolitik. Die ersten Toten eines Krieges im Herzen Europas sind zu beklagen. Bundeskanzler Scholz spricht von einem furchtbaren Tag für die Ukraine und einem düsteren Tag für Europa. Tschechiens Präsident Miloš Zeman von einem Verbrechen gegen den Frieden, das Russland begeht. Schwedens Ministerpräsidentin Magdalena Andersson von einem neuen dunklen Kapitel in Europas Geschichte, das heute eingeleitet worden sei. Und wer würde der Analyse der schwedischen Außenministerin Ann Linde widersprechen? Wir stehen vor der schwerwiegendsten sicherheitspolitischen Lage seit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg. Vor wenigen Stunden äußerte sich NATO-Generalsekretär Stoltenberg. Wir haben jetzt einen Krieg in Europa in einem Ausmaß und einer Art, von der wir dachten, sie gehöre der Vergangenheit an. Stoltenberg verweist auf eine neue Normalität für unsere Sicherheit und fügt hinzu, Frieden ist keine Selbstverständlichkeit. Wir haben uns in Zeiten der Corona-Pandemie an manche neue Normalität gewöhnen müssen. Und wir fürchten uns vor dieser neuen Normalität, die der NATO-Generalsekretär beschreibt, aber wahrscheinlich ganz zu Recht. Und es ist Aufgabe von Wissenschaft und Politik zugleich, Antworten zu finden auf diese neue Normalität. Vor diesem Hintergrund geht es in der Tat um die Souveränitäts- und um die Identitätsfrage. Wie ist es denn um die strategische Souveränität der Europäischen Union bestellt, von der auch der Koalitionsvertrag der Ampel weiß und auf die er sich bezieht? Eint oder trennt uns die äußere Aggression? Ist Europa einiger oder wird es sich weiter voneinander entfernen angesichts dessen, was wir in der Ukraine erleben müssen? Gilt es Werte oder Interessen? Oder vielleicht doch beides gleichzeitig, wenn das überhaupt möglich ist, zu verteidigen. Und ohne Zweifel ist der Raum Europas betroffen, wenn an den EU-Außengrenzen territoriale Souveränität von russischer Seite mit Füßen getreten und Europas territoriale Ordnung grundlegend infrage gestellt wird. Erwarten Sie vom Hamburg-Vigoni Forum bitte keine fixen Antworten auf diese komplexen Fragen, sondern eher suchende Fragestellungen. Ich bin außerordentlich glücklich und dankbar, dass an diesem für alle so schwierigen Tag viele Kolleginnen und Kollegen sich bereit gefunden haben, diese Fragen mit uns zu diskutieren. Wir werden, wenn es klappt, gleich den Staatssekretär im Ministerium für Entwicklung und Zusammenarbeit, Herrn Niels Annen, hören, der vormals Staatsminister im Auswärtigen Amt gewesen ist, der uns ganz tagesaktuell seine Einschätzung zur Ukraine-Lage präsentieren wird. Bitte haben Sie ein wenig Geduld und wenn es nicht klappen sollte, aber ich sehe gerade den Daumen nach oben, es klappt. Wir sind außerordentlich glücklich und dankbar, dass an einem Tag, an dem sich so viele Aufgaben wie heute stellen, Herr Annen sich die Zeit für uns nimmt, wenigstens 5 Minuten bei uns zu sein, 15 Minuten bei uns zu sein. Wenn es nur 5 Minuten sind, sind wir Ihnen auch dankbar. Lieber Herr Annen, ich bin außerordentlich glücklich und dankbar. Es geht nicht darum, Staatspräsident Levits zu ersetzen, aber es geht darum, die Tagesaktualität dieser dunklen Stunde aufzugreifen. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie das für unser Forum und in unserem Forum tun. Herzlich willkommen aus Berlin.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Ich hoffe, Sie hören und sehen mich und ich sende Ihnen Grüße hier aus Berlin. Es ist tatsächlich ein Tag, der auch mich persönlich nicht einfach so kalt lässt. Und ich glaube, das geht uns allen so. Ich habe erst gestern noch ein bisschen auch in den Hamburger Medien die Berichterstattung über den Besuch von Staatspräsident Levits verfolgt und Sie haben das schon gesagt, ich kann und will ihn hier nicht ersetzen. Ich glaube, wir haben alle Verständnis dafür, dass er unter diesen Rahmenbedingungen den Besuch abbrechen musste. Aber ich will Ihnen gerne hier ein paar Gedanken zu der aktuellen Lage einfach vortragen und das mit Ihnen teilen und will mich aber auch bedanken, dass das Hamburg-Vigoni Forum jetzt auch so, ich sage mal, tagesaktuell reagiert. Und ich glaube, dass wir solche Plattformen benötigen. Natürlich ist es heute ein ganz besonderer Tag, aber wir werden uns darauf einstellen müssen, dass dieser Krieg, und Sie haben den Bundeskanzler ja bereits zitiert, der, wie ich finde, sehr treffend gesagt hat, dass es Putins Krieg ist. Er hat diese Entscheidung getroffen, alle diplomatischen Auswege, die ihm aufgezeigt worden sind, auszuschlagen, hat sein Nachbarland angegriffen, dass diese Entscheidung langfristige, grundlegende Veränderungen in der europäischen Sicherheitsarchitektur zur Folge haben wird. Und das stellt auch die deutsche und die europäische Politik vor eine große Herausforderung. Und ich will deswegen am Anfang nur sagen, wir kommen nicht mit einem Blueprint als Politik um die Ecke, sondern wir müssen diese Lage neu analysieren. Natürlich gibt es viele Diskussionen, auch im Bereich der Wissenschaft, der politikberatenden Wissenschaft, der Thinktanks. Und trotzdem ist es eine Herausforderung, von der ich überzeugt bin, dass es gut ist, wissenschaftlichen Rat einzuholen und den Dialog auch mit der Wissenschaft zu führen. Und insofern ist es vielleicht auch gerade an diesem Tag richtig, sich an ein solches Forum in meiner Heimatstadt Hamburg auch zu wenden. Und insofern sage ich vielen Dank für diese Gelegenheit. Mein Eindruck, und man muss ja aufpassen an einem solchen Tag, dass man auch unter dem persönlichen Eindruck dieser Ereignisse da nicht zu kategorischen, vorschnellen Schlüssen kommt. Trotzdem ist mein Eindruck, dass wir eine Situation haben, in der der Traum von einem gemeinsamen europäischen Haus, der ja nicht nur ein Traum war, sondern an dem ja auch gearbeitet worden ist, mit der Helsinki-Schlussakte, mit der Charta von Paris, mit vielen diplomatischen, zivilgesellschaftlichen Initiativen, dass dieser Traum heute zerstört worden ist. Das bedeutet natürlich nicht, dass man die Zielsetzung aufgeben darf, aber wir müssen uns auf eine wahrscheinlich lange Phase der politischen Eiszeit einstellen. Diplomatie bleibt unerlässlich und sie bleibt auch wichtig. Und ich finde es auch sehr, sehr wichtig, dass wir gerade in diesen Stunden auch deutlich machen, alles, was in enger Absprache der amerikanische Präsident Biden, der französische Präsident Macron, der deutsche Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz und andere auf den Tisch gelegt haben, das liegt weiterhin auf dem Tisch, wenn der russische Präsident der dramatischen Aufforderung des UN-Generalsekretärs Folge leisten sollte, seine Truppen nach Russland zurückzubeordern. Und wir können den diplomatischen Weg nicht abschreiben. Wir müssen uns aber auch eingestehen, dass er zumindest Stand heute erst einmal gescheitert ist. Und das bedeutet, dass wahrscheinlich, ich sage mal auch die politische Generation, die ich ein bisschen mit repräsentiere, aber auch die vielen neu gewählten, meistens sehr, sehr viel jüngeren Kolleginnen und Kollegen im Deutschen Bundestag, wo wir ja wirklich einen Generationenwechsel eingeleitet haben, dass wir uns zurückbesinnen müssen auf eine Phase, in der es auch in der zumindest westdeutschen Geschichte ja fast zur außenpolitischen Normalität gehört hat, diplomatische Initiativen, aber eben auch ein größeres Engagement, ein größeres Investment in Abschreckung, auch militärische Abschreckung, miteinander zu verknüpfen. Ich erwähne Abschreckung nicht, um damit anzudeuten, dass es eine militärische Option für den Westen in der Ukraine geben könnte. Das halte ich, so hart das klingen mag, für einen Nicht-NATO-Staat wie die Ukraine für ausgeschlossen, weil es schlicht und ergreifend, und das ist auch das, was Joe Biden ja öffentlich gesagt hat, die Gefahr eines Weltkrieges mit sich bringen würde. Aber, und das ist nun ein bisschen dem Zufall des Terminkalenders geschuldet, dass wir in Hamburg Staatspräsident Levits begrüßen durften. Aber es bedeutet natürlich insbesondere für die ganz extrem explodierten baltischen Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union und der NATO, dass wir noch mehr tun müssen, um diese Ostflanke der NATO zu stärken und zu stützen. Die deutsche Verteidigungsministerin Frau Lambrecht war in ihrer kurzen Amtszeit bereits zweimal im Baltikum. Wir haben heute die Entscheidung getroffen, unsere Kräfte in Rumänien zu verstärken. Es gilt aber wahrscheinlich auch in den nächsten Tagen und Wochen für das Baltikum insgesamt. Wir werden uns enger abstimmen müssen. Und ja, es bedeutet auch, dass der Pfad, auf den wir uns begeben haben seit einiger Zeit, nämlich der Pfad, systematisch Jahr für Jahr die Ausgaben für Verteidigung zu erhöhen, dass wir diesen Pfad weitergehen müssen. Und ich sage das nicht gerne, aber ich sage das auch sehr bewusst als jemand, der hier nicht das Verteidigungsministerium, sondern das wahrscheinlich zivilste Ministerium der Bundesregierung, nämlich das für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit und Kooperation vertreten darf. Aber es kann eben nicht alternativ gedacht werden. Und deswegen brauchen wir auch eine Debatte darüber, wie denn eigentlich die neue Ordnung in Europa aussehen wird. Und es ist ja fast ein bisschen eine bittere Ironie der Geschichte, dass zumindest, wenn ich richtig informiert bin, der Vortrag des Staatspräsidenten Europa als Werte- und Rechtsgemeinschaft überschrieben war. Und ich will da nicht den Vortrag ersetzen, das kann ich auch gar nicht, aber ich will schon einmal sagen, was wir heute erlebt haben. Das ist natürlich auch ein gezielter Angriff auf diese Werte, vor allem aber auch auf diese Rechtsgemeinschaft. Wir dürfen hier nicht vergessen, die Russische Föderation ist ein ständiges Mitglied im Sicherheitsrat der Vereinten Nationen, der den Auftrag hat, den Weltfrieden zu bewahren und die internationale Rechtsordnung zu verteidigen. Und dass ein Sicherheitsratsmitglied eine so offene Verletzung des internationalen Rechts und die Verhöhnung der Souveränität eines Nachbarstaates zu seiner Politik erklärt, das wird natürlich nicht nur Folgen für die Ukraine und die Sicherheit in Europa haben, sondern für die Akzeptanz des internationalen Rechts. Und ich muss schon sagen, ich möchte hier nicht zur schlechten Laune beitragen. Ich hoffe, dass Sie das nicht falsch verstehen, aber man muss natürlich auch sagen, die ersten Äußerungen, die uns aus China erreichen, sind ebenfalls ein Grund zu allergrößter Sorge. Denn wenn ich das richtig gelesen habe, dann wurde dort ja erklärt, die Vereinigten Staaten seien im Grunde genommen schuld an dieser Eskalation. Und das ist eine Veränderung in der Position, wie wir sie noch vom chinesischen Außenminister wenige Tage zuvor auf der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz zur Kenntnis nehmen durften. Also, um einen Strich drunter zu machen, wir werden uns zurückbesinnen müssen auf Instrumente, die wir zwar niemals vollkommen aufgegeben haben, von denen wir aber gehofft haben, dass sie die deutsche und europäische Politik nicht mehr in dem Maße bestimmen müssen, wie es in den Zeiten des Kalten Krieges der Fall war. Das sind die Stichworte Abschreckungsdispositiv und Containment. Aber gleichzeitig, und das ist auch eine Einladung, wenn Sie so wollen, auch eine Aufforderung an Sie, können wir nicht die Konzepte aus der Zeit des Kalten Krieges einfach hier sozusagen kopieren, weil die Ausgangslage wesentlich komplexer ist. Und deswegen brauchen wir jetzt eine gemeinsame Anstrengung, auch was die Konzeption unserer Politik betrifft. Und ich will zum Schluss, und ich muss ein bisschen um Verständnis bitten, weil ich gleich leider schon wieder in die nächste Schalte muss, zu der ich auch nicht zu spät kommen kann. Ich will zum Schluss sagen, was positiv war an den letzten Wochen. Das ist die enge Abstimmung zwischen den demokratischen Regierungen, den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika, der Europäischen Union und der NATO. Und das ist keine Selbstverständlichkeit. Das haben wir in den 4 schwierigen Trump-Jahren erlebt. Und man muss auch sagen, wenn man sich die Äußerung des ehemaligen Präsidenten anschaut, steckt darin auch eine Botschaft an uns Europäer. Wir können die Amerikaner nicht selbstverständlich auf unserer Seite einbuchen, weil es nicht festgeschrieben steht, dass Joe Biden Präsident bleibt oder eine ähnliche politische Kraft in Zukunft die amerikanische Politik dominieren wird. Aber in der jetzigen Situation ist es ein Glücksfall, dass wir diesen amerikanischen Präsidenten haben. Die Botschaften sind abgestimmt. Die Sanktionspakete, auf die wir uns jetzt leider verständigen müssen, sind eng miteinander koordiniert. Und ich glaube schon, dass Wladimir Putin nicht mit einer solchen transatlantischen Einigkeit gerechnet hat, auch nicht unbedingt innerhalb der Europäischen Union. Und ich muss sagen, ich habe mich manchmal ein bisschen gewundert und zum Teil auch darüber geärgert, wie in der amerikanischen, aber auch in der deutschen Öffentlichkeit diese Geschichte der Unzuverlässigkeit Deutschlands erzählt worden ist. Ich habe niemals auch nur eine Sekunde daran geglaubt, dass das stimmt. Aber wir haben jetzt, denke ich, deutlich gemacht, dass diese Debatte erstens, verzeihen Sie den Ausdruck, an den Haaren herbeigezogen war, aber uns auch nicht genützt hat. Und dass diese Einigkeit, aber auch diese Entschlossenheit durch die ersten Äußerungen und Entscheidungen des Bundeskanzlers nach der russischen Deklaration der Unabhängigkeit dieser sogenannten Volksrepubliken so schnell gekommen ist, das war, glaube ich, auch ein wichtiges Zeichen in Richtung Moskau, aber auch in Richtung unserer Verbündeten. Und deswegen wünsche ich uns allen, dass es uns gelingen wird, und das hätte ich mir auch nicht träumen lassen, dass ich das einmal in einer öffentlichen Versammlung sagen würde, dass es uns gelingt, den Frieden in Europa wiederherzustellen und dass es uns gelingt, die Einigkeit in unserem Bündnis zu bewahren und dass wir das aufbringen, was auch in einer solchen Situation nicht vergessen werden darf, nämlich, dass es Probleme gibt auf dieser Welt, die keine Auszeit uns erlauben. Die Klimakrise wird nicht warten, nur weil es einen Krieg zwischen Russland und der Ukraine gibt. Und das Pandemie-Management bedarf ebenfalls globaler Kooperation. Wir sind in den letzten Jahren zurückgefallen bei der Erfüllung der sogenannten Nachhaltigkeitsziele, haben das erste Mal wieder Einbrüche bei der Bekämpfung von Armut auf der Welt zur Kenntnis nehmen müssen. Und das bedeutet, eine verantwortliche Politik aus Deutschland und Europa heraus darf nicht nur die Punkte berücksichtigen, über die ich eben gesprochen habe, sondern sie muss es auch erreichen, trotz dieser neuen Situation in Europa, in den Menschheitsfragen kooperationsfähig zu bleiben. Auch, und das sage ich ganz bewusst an diesem Tag, auch mit Russland. Und dafür brauchen wir am Ende so etwas wie, früher hätte man gesagt, staatsmännisches Verhalten. Und das zeigt auch, wie groß die Aufgabe ist. Ich bedanke mich, dass Sie mir zugehört haben. Ich hoffe, dass Sie Verständnis dafür haben, dass ich meine kurzen Ausführungen jetzt hier abschließen muss und wünsche aber trotz der dramatischen Lage dem Projekt viel Erfolg und alles Gute.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, lieber Herr Annen. Wir sind Ihnen außerordentlich dankbar, dass Sie diese wertvollen 15 Minuten für uns Zeit gefunden haben und 2 Stichworte geliefert haben, die Politik und Wissenschaft sicher miteinander verbinden. Wir haben beide kein Blueprint und wir kennen beide keine Auszeiten. Ganz herzlichen Dank nach Berlin. Ich glaube, damit sind in der Tat 2 ganz zentrale Stichworte gefallen. Wissenschaft kennt kein Blueprint, die ewige Wahrheitssuche ist etwas, was immer fortgeschrieben und neu gedacht werden muss. Und wir müssen uns bei diesem Neudenken immer auch vergegenwärtigen, dass bei aller Dramatik, bei aller Enttäuschung des heutigen Tages die Fragen nicht gelöst sind. Wir weiterdenken müssen, dass wir auch angesichts eklatanter Völkerrechtsbrüche das Völkerrecht nicht aufgeben dürfen, dass wir auch in kritischen Zeiten für Europa das Europarecht nicht abschreiben dürfen. Dramaturgie und Dramatik des Tages ist es geschuldet, dass das Grußwort von Frau Staatsrätin Möller zu einer Art Begleitwort für diese Konferenz wird, weil es nun der Rede von Herrn Annen nachgeschaltet ist. Wir freuen uns aber genauso und umso mehr darauf. Wir wissen es besonders zu schätzen, Frau Möller, dass Sie die Zeit gefunden haben, diesem Tag, der auch für Sie und für den gesamten Senat der Freien und Hansestadt Hamburg ein turbulenter ist, trotzdem nicht zu sagen, Wissenschaft ist sozusagen nicht systemrelevant, sondern uns die Zeit schenken. Wir freuen uns sehr auf Ihr Begleitwort. Sie haben die Bühne.
Sehr geehrter Herr Staatssekretär Annen, sehr geehrter lieber Herr Professor Kotzur, sehr geehrte Frau Dr. Selle, sehr geehrter Herr Bellet, sehr geehrte Frau Professorin Schröder. Sie haben es gesagt, lieber Herr Kotzur, wir stehen alle unter dem Eindruck der dramatischen Entwicklung der vergangenen Stunden. Und ich bin Staatssekretär Annen sehr dankbar dafür, dass er sich die Zeit genommen hat, aus seiner Perspektive der Bundesregierung zu berichten, eine Einordnung dieser dramatischen Entwicklungen vorzunehmen und eine Rückbindung an das, was Thema des heutigen Abends ist, hergestellt hat. Und möchte ihm auch von dieser Stelle für die wichtigen Aufgaben, die anstehen und denen er sich jetzt widmen muss, selbstverständlich alles Gute wünschen. Ja, Sie sehen, meine Damen und Herren, wir sind heute in einer anderen Welt aufgewacht und Herr Professor Kotzur sagt es betrifft uns unmittelbar. Es ist kein fernes Thema und ich würde deswegen gerne kurz einordnend Ihnen berichten über die Einschätzung der Lage von Seiten des Senats. Der erste Bürgermeister hat hier vor einer Stunde Stellung genommen, öffentlich. Vielleicht eingangs, Staatspräsident Levits hat gestern, das wissen Sie, das Rathaus besucht. Der Bürgermeister hatte die Ehre, mit Herrn Staatspräsidenten sich auszutauschen. Und Sie können sich vorstellen, dass auch dieser Austausch intensiv sich befasst hat und befassen musste mit den Themen, die wir heute in einer dramatischen, von Russland ausgehenden Eskalation sehen. Der erste Bürgermeister hat es sehr deutlich gemacht, dass das Themen sind, die uns alle betreffen, uns alle doch, wenn auch in unterschiedlicher Weise, aber im Kern miteinander betreffen und selbstverständlich in vielen existenziellen Fragen denen wir uns jetzt widmen müssen, auch, und das war auch Teil dieses Gespräches, natürlich der Blick in das Gemeinsame, in die Zukunft wichtig ist. Das, was uns stärkt im gemeinsamen Handeln, aber es ist auch klar, dass am heutigen Tage das, was uns als europäische Werte, als europäische Rechts- und auch als Sicherheitsgemeinschaft betrifft, dass das im Fundament angegriffen ist. Der erste Bürgermeister hat selbstverständlich die Solidarität den Menschen in der Ukraine, über die Leid hereinbricht, über die Zerstörung hereinbricht, durch diese Aggression ausgedrückt und hat sich auch an die Menschen gewandt, die in Hamburg leben, mit Wurzeln, mit Verbindungen in die Ukraine, die alle jetzt in dieser Situation in schweren Stunden in Sorge sind um ihre Familien, um Freunde und um ihre Heimat. Und gleichzeitig hat er zum Ausdruck gebracht, dass das ein Thema ist, was es in einer international ausgerichteten Stadt, in einem Gliedstaat der Bundesrepublik Deutschland selbstverständlich auch sehr unmittelbare Betroffenheit auslöst. Das ist die Aufgabe für den Senat, im praktizierten Föderalismus der Bund-Länder-Kooperation jetzt in diesen schweren Stunden auch in diese Kooperation zu gehen und miteinander dann auch Schritte einzuleiten, auch auf Ebene unseres Stadtstaates hier, dort wo Entscheidungen getroffen werden müssen, die im Zusammenhang mit der russischen Aggression und dem eklatanten Bruch des Völkerrechts stehen. Ich werde, lieber Herr Professor Kotzur, den Versuch machen, ein wenig das aufzunehmen, was Anliegen Ihrer Konferenz ist. Und ich bin sehr froh, dass Staatssekretär Annen unterstrichen hat, wie wichtig es ist, dass es Raum gibt, auch in einer solchen dramatischen Lage, sich zu vergewissern und versuchen zu durchdringen, auch wenn viele Dinge unklar ist, welche Fragen müssen wir uns jetzt stellen. Und lieber Herr Kotzur, Sie haben eine ganze Reihe wichtiger Fragen bereits gestellt und das ist natürlich etwas, mit dem Erkenntnis beginnt. Und ich bin dankbar, dass es die Möglichkeit dieses Austausches auch an einem solchen Tage gibt, der für mich persönlich eine etwas andere Taktung natürlich hatte, aber die Möglichkeit hier auch miteinander ins Gespräch zu kommen, ist wichtig. Ich würde gerne einige Worte über diese Konferenz, diese wichtige Konferenz und über das Vigoni Forum sagen, sehr geehrte Anwesende. Denn ich glaube, dass es ein außerordentlich wichtiger Tag insofern natürlich für die Zukunft Europas ist, aber es ist auch ein Tag, an dem eine solche Konferenz mit Ihnen allen, und Sie werden ja miteinander noch weiter beraten, dass das eine Konferenz ist, die selbstverständlich dadurch auch wichtig ist und in die Zeit passt. Mit dem Hamburg-Vigoni Forum haben sich die Universität Hamburg und die Villa Vigoni ein ehrgeiziges Ziel gesetzt. Forschung und Politik sollen auf innovative Weise miteinander ins Gespräch kommen und Deutungsangebote entwickeln, die Bürgerinnen und Bürgern vermitteln, was Europa zusammenhält. Und ich habe in meiner vorherigen Zeit, bevor ich in diese Aufgabe in der Hamburger Senatskanzlei kam, mich über viele Jahre im, ich nenne es mal, vorwissenschaftlichen Raum, politiknahen vorwissenschaftlichen Raum, sehr intensiv mit Fragen des Zusammenhalts beschäftigt. Und erlauben Sie mir die persönliche Bemerkung, auch ich bin ein Kind einer Generation, die aufgewachsen ist in Westeuropa mit den vielen Möglichkeiten, die das Zusammenwachsen unseres Kontinents ermöglicht hat, und stehe heute auch hier in großer Betroffenheit, weil wir ja schon in den letzten Monaten und Jahren gemerkt haben, wie stark an den Grundfesten dieser europäischen Idee gerüttelt werden kann und dass wir viele Dinge nicht für selbstverständlich nehmen sollten. Und dieser Lernprozess, und das gebe ich persönlich ganz offen zu, das ist auch ein schmerzvoller und das ist auch ein schwieriger hier und da, weil ich selbstverständlich für mich auch sagen kann, ich habe gewisse Sichtweisen eingeübt auf das, was Europa zusammenhalten kann. Und diese Form, die Staatssekretär Annen sehr gut beschrieben hat, des Angriffs auf das, was uns im Kern zusammenhält, das habe ich nicht für möglich gehalten und es stellt heute tatsächlich uns vor ganz neue und sehr weitreichende Fragen, selbstverständlich unmittelbar, aber auch in der mittel- bis langfristigen Perspektive. Das Vigoni Forum, lieber Herr Professor Kotzur, Sie sagten, es wird seine Arbeit an den Konzepten Souveränität und Identität fortsetzen und deren Relevanz für die Bewältigung der aktuellen Herausforderungen zu ermitteln. Und das ist natürlich etwas, was uns vor dem Hintergrund der Entwicklung des heutigen Tages nochmal in großer Tragweite deutlich wird. Wir brauchen auch diese Antworten. Und der Dialog zwischen Wissenschaft und Politik, sage ich als jemand, die zumindest in der Nähe der Wissenschaft lange Zeit verbracht hat. Dieser Dialog ist natürlich gerade in dieser Zeit außerordentlich wichtig, denn an Herausforderungen mangelt es nicht. Auch das hat Staatssekretär angesagt. Wir haben eine ganze Reihe von Themen, die uns in der Europäischen Union in Bezug auf unsere Souveränität und auf unsere Freiheit schon in den vergangenen Monaten und Jahren beschäftigt haben. Viele davon sind aufgezählt worden. Die werden uns ja auch nicht in Ruhe lassen. Und das ist etwas, wo es aus meiner Sicht wichtig ist, dass man auch beginnend bei den richtigen Fragen Antworten darauf findet, wie europäischer Zusammenhalt, unter welchen Voraussetzungen weiterhin erfolgen kann. Und ich glaube, diese sehr existenzielle Frage von Zusammenhalt, die merken wir selten so stark wie an solchen Tagen, wo es wirklich auch um unsere Unversehrtheit geht und um die Grundlagen unseres Zusammenseins. Denn das will ich vielleicht abschließend noch sagen, bevor wir in den inhaltlichen Austausch hier eintreten wollen. Und Sie haben hingewiesen darauf, dass wir in einer Zeit uns befinden, in der die Europäische Union sich auf allen Ebenen mit der Frage der Zukunft beschäftigt. Dass diese Zukunft jetzt unter anderen Voraussetzungen stattfinden wird und gleichzeitig wir im Blick behalten, wo wir begonnen haben als Staaten und Völker Europas. Walter Hallstein, das muss ich Ihnen nicht nahebringen, das wissen Sie, verdanken wir die Erkenntnis, dass Europa eine Schöpfung des Rechts ist. Die Europäische Gemeinschaft sei daher eine bewusste rechtlich geordnete Gestaltung unserer europäischen Welt. So hat es Hallstein am 12. März 1962 in der Universität Padua formuliert. Und diese zutreffende Beschreibung des Aufbaus der Europäischen Gemeinschaft, die bedarf einer ständigen Selbstvergewisserung. Und das spüren wir. Und das spüren wir sehr existenziell. Wir spüren es auch in anderen Feldern. Ich weiß, die Präsidentin der Europäischen Bewegung ist hier auch gleich in unserem Gespräch dabei. Wir spüren es in der Frage der Ausgestaltung von Justiz, von freier Presse, von Umgang mit Minderheiten in Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union. Wir sehen, dass es eine Fragilität in dieser Rechtsgemeinschaft auch nach innen gibt, mit der wir uns befassen, mit der wir uns auch in der Konferenz der Europaministerinnen und Europaminister der Länder befassen. Das ist ein Feld, das außerordentlich wichtig bleibt, obgleich wir heute natürlich unter dem Eindruck der aktuellen Entwicklungen stehen. Und auch hier hoffe ich und bin ich sicher, dass wir Anregungen finden in der sich anschließenden Debatte, denn diese steht unter dem Eindruck der Einordnung des Konditionalitätsmechanismus, den der EuGH vergangene Woche ja bestätigt hat. Ich will vielleicht abschließend selbstverständlich eines tun, lieber Herr Professor Kotzur und all diejenigen, die sich engagieren im Rahmen des Vigoni Forums und den Plänen, die Sie haben, wirklich alles Gute zu wünschen und viel Erfolg mit den Themen, die Sie sich vorgenommen haben, mit den außerordentlich wichtigen Themen. Ich freue mich auf Gelegenheiten des Austausches. Das habe ich in der Vergangenheit sozusagen aus einer anderen Perspektive immer als sehr fruchtbar empfunden, wenn sozusagen die Wissenschaft und die Politik miteinander ins Gespräch kommen. Und ich kann es jetzt in meiner Rolle, die ich seit einigen Jahren ausfülle, aus dieser Perspektive sagen, dass ich es weiterhin für außerordentlich wichtig halte. Frau Professor Schröder, wir haben an anderer Stelle häufiger über diese Themen auch bereits gesprochen. Das ist nicht einfach und banal, weil natürlich die Welten auch unterschiedlich funktionieren in Sprache, in Instrumenten, die sich da begegnen. Und sozusagen diese Formen der Kommunikation bedeuten auch, dass man Brücken miteinander entwickeln muss, damit man gut ins Gespräch kommen kann. Und auch hier glaube ich, dass das Vigoni Forum einen sehr guten Ansatz gewählt hat, um genau hier auch eine Brückenfunktion zu bilden. Und ich möchte Ihnen und uns allen dafür alles Gute wünschen und bedanke mich für die Einladung, für die Gelegenheit, hier zu Ihnen zu sprechen an diesem Tag, der das, was Europa ausmacht, noch in anderer Weise in Grundfesten erschüttert hat. Und das ist auch Teil der europäischen Idee, dass selbstverständlich Europäerinnen und Europäer miteinander sich diesen Herausforderungen stellen. Wir sind ein Stadtstaat, wir sind im europäischen Vergleich vielleicht eine große Stadt, im globalen Vergleich eher im mittleren Bereich unterwegs, aber wir sind selbstverständlich Teil dieser Europäischen Union und Teil eines Landes, das sich sehr aktiv für den Zusammenhalt in der EU eingesetzt hat und wird. Und insoweit bin ich dankbar dafür, dass es dieses Forum gibt, das sich mit diesen Fragen beschäftigt. Vielen Dank.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, liebe Frau Möller. Wenn ich Sie gleich zum Platz auf dem Podium begleiten darf und zugleich alle anderen Panelists einladen darf, das Podium zu betreten, damit wir unsere Diskussionsarbeit anschließen können. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie alle an diesem Tag den Weg zu uns gefunden haben und bin sehr gespannt auf den Austausch. Ladies and gentlemen, as announced in the program, we will now switch into English because we have one guest who is not a German native speaker, and even though he excellently speaks German, he prefers to speak in English, and I'm quite sure that we all will understand. But of course, the audience is also very welcome to raise all kinds of questions in German. We will for sure be able to handle that. And the invitation to raise and ask questions goes not only to the audience here at the Audi Max at the University of Hamburg, but also everybody back home at the live stream. We will have means of communication. And of course, I can't promise that we answer all your questions because there might be quite a lot, but we try to do our best, at least we can answer some questions. Before we start that, I have the pleasure to introduce the guests of our panel, and I will start with Almut Möller. You already got to know her. She is State Councillor and Plenipotentiary of the Free and Hanseatic City of Hamburg to the federal government, the European Union, and also responsible for foreign affairs. Thank you very much to have you here. It's wonderful. And you already spoke about your background as a political scientist. I think you are in person the perfect bridge between scientific debates and political decision-making. And therefore, we are very, very happy to have you here tonight. The next guest I would like to introduce is Dr. Lynn Selle. She is the president of the European Movement, also a political scientist, and working also representing one of the German Länder with the Federation and with European Union affairs. I think it's wonderful to have you here, and it's wonderful that you will give voice to, so to speak, civil society. You know, that sounds quite strong, but I think it's very important that you tell us a bit, about the European movement. What is the driving force for you to be so strongly engaged and, putting so much time and effort next to your job into the European movement? We are very, very happy to have Professor Ursula Schröder. She is not replacing President Levits for many reasons, but she agreed it was rather like an attack of my side, to join the panel tonight because she is an expert also of political sciences, and as you already have heard, the director of the Hamburg-based Institute for Peace and Security Studies. And I think it's very important to have tonight an emphasis on peace and security and not only on war and aggression. Therefore, we are very happy to have you here, Professor Schröder, and she is a member of the Vigoni Forum anyway, which is supported by the University of Hamburg, Europa-Konferenz Hamburg, the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, and Villa Vigoni, and the director of the Villa Vigoni. She just sent me an email this very minute and she says hello and best greetings to everybody, and she is quite touched by what we do. And I think she is here with us in mind and in spirit. Last but not least, we are very, very happy that for that important debate, we also have a representative of the European Commission, Ivo Bellet. He has been the deputy head of cabinet of the commissioner and the vice president of the commission, Ms. Suissa, who is responsible for demography and democracy in Europe. And Monsieur Bellet was responsible for for the conference on the future of Europe and the organization of that conference. And I think this is the very topic. And I think it's also most topical because, as Almut Möller said, we should exactly discuss these questions. We know that as, scientists, we will not stop the intervention and the acts of aggression and the armed attack in Ukraine, but I think we can continue to discuss these important European things, and therefore we might start with the Ukraine conflict and slowly but surely also come back to address the very topics that we had in mind when we organized that conference a couple of months ago. But, Mrs. Seller, I would like to start with you. I think that's a question you have been asked 1,000 times today and yesterday and this week. As president of the European movement, watching, observing what happened in Ukraine, and, it came in its aggressiveness as a surprise, but it was, I think there was the script already on the table, what would happen. What is the reaction, what is the reaction of somebody who speaks for civil society, seeing the European ideas and ideals challenged in such a way in this very moment?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great being here in Hamburg in person, which is very much welcomed, despite these dark times. So the European movement Germany is a very old lady, you could say. So my organization has been built or has been founded in 1948 after World War II, also together with the Council of Europe. We come from the same spirits. And for an organization that has been built on what was left over of Europe at that time, from people who were engaged against Nazi Germany, who tried to rebuild a European order after the war. It is, of course, a tragedy that this peace project, upon which not only the European movement Germany has been founded, but the whole European sphere. It's not only the European movement, it's also the Council of Europe. It's so many organizations and institutions that have been built after the war. It's a tragedy to see this today, and so we have been in close contact with many of our members, our board, these past days, and it's clear that for us, there has been an act of aggression. I think I don't have to repeat what has been said by Almut Möller and by Niels Ann, but I think we really have to contemplate about what this European peace project is all about, how we deal with this situation in the short term, but also, of course, how we will be able to foster mutual understanding between the European Union and Ukraine, but also in the long term, of course, also with Russia. Actually, to be honest, I've been a bit shocked when Niels Ann said, well, we have to be will make ourselves available to the thought that we might enter a new phase of deterrence and a new well, he didn't say Cold War, but it sounded a bit like that. And I think this is really, really tragic for all the civil society cooperation that has been going on in the past years. Of course, it got more and more, well, even dangerous and more critical, especially with on the Russian side. But we have to continue talking to each other despite all the things that go wrong but at least on the civil society level. So, yeah, a day of, a sad day for Europe, for the peace project, but also for everything that's happening in Ukraine and the families affected.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Seller. Let me turn to Ursula Schröder. A period of deterrence, I think, of course, a serious scientific comment on what happened in Ukraine would not be my question, because that simply can't be done at the very moment it happens. But I would like to know, what happened today from the perspective in that conflict, in the aggression. Is that something that has a strong impact on the European Union as a peace community, on the very idea of a peace community, because I think many of us, and I'm quite sure that also many people watching us back home, feel very kind of, helpless. We are sticking to these values and we are kind of, claiming that we have a value-oriented foreign policy and so on and so forth. But, how strong, how reliable, how credible is that European peace community, given the horrible things that we see happening today?
Thank you. That is an excellent question for today, because what we've heard today in other comments so far is that this is a long-term challenge that we will have to deal with for the years to come. It's a question of European futures, not only of European security futures, but also of European future overall. How do we construct a European peace project that Dr. Selle just said is under threat? How do we defend a European peace project, both to the inside and to the outside? And I use this defend deliberately, because obviously we have to look for ways to bring us together in Europe. And the question is, who's we? This is something that we can also discuss as a part of this forum, of the Vigoni Forum, Hamburg-Vigoni Forum, to look at the construction of the we, because we know all the long-term contentious debates about security in Europe, about the question of whether European security is possible with or without Russia, or the question that has been put on the agenda again by Josep Borrell, whether the choice of free alliances in Europe is the baseline of the European security architecture. And these large-scale questions, they won't go away, because we know that the European peace project has been integrative to a set of countries in Europe and has worked really well for the past 75, 80 years. But it has always had a challenge on the East. It has always had the challenge of how to integrate Russia and how to deal with the Russian challenge. And it hasn't found very stable and sustainable ways of doing it, as we can see now. And the question is, what do we as Europeans, what do we in the European Union do? And I was heartened today by the joint press conference of the European Union and NATO, where Commission President von der Leyen said, "We are today more united than before. We are one alliance and one group of states fighting against this aggression." And this is something that in the last 20 years of watching and observing EU-NATO relations on security and defense is something unusual. I'm so accustomed to listening to, oh, we need a European caucus within NATO. This could be 2000, this could be 2021. I can't remember the times I've heard that. And suddenly we have more unity. And this is actually, speaking personally, one of the worries I had when I watched Russian policy. The attempt by President Putin to divide Europe is something that I think is very dangerous to the European future and to the European peace project. And today I saw this division at this point in time hasn't worked. And I think our job is to make sure that this doesn't work in the future, because we need to be united and we need to figure out what the we is. And as a peace researcher, I say this we has to be as inclusive as possible, and we have to find a way to negotiate with Russia. As also Niels Annen said before, that we have to return at some point to an understanding of what to do with the Russian threat that we have here today. And we have to build another European house. We have to build a new house, and the blueprint is not there. But research can contribute to the blueprint. We have very stable research findings on cooperation. We have stable research findings on orders and on ways of negotiation. And I think this needs to be brought to the table now.
Thank you so much. You provided exactly the keyword I was looking for, and therefore I'm all the more happy that I could spontaneously kind of, get you on the panel, because that's exactly the key question. Who are the we? Who are the European we in that very situation? And that's also the perfect kind of, bridge to my question for Monsieur Belli, because the conference on the future of Europe is exactly about who are the we. And I would like to, get your opinion not only on today's horrible day and what it does with the European we, but also the very ideas of that conference on the future of Europe. Is it a suitable mean to really strengthen the European we and also to, I think, critically address the we? Because we very often hear that there are very emphatic kind of, statements about European identity and so on, and at the end of the day, nobody really believes it. The European we is nothing that is just there, it's something that needs to be built. In building the European we, facing a day like today and facing the conference on the future of Europe, we are very glad that you will share your opinions, insights and ideas with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kotsur. And I've been listening with great interest to the three previous speakers, and I agree with, on behalf of the Vice President of the European Commission, who is also the co-chair of the Conference on the Future of Europe. I think I can agree with most that has been said. And of course, thank you very much for this invitation, first of all. And we were intrigued, of course, when we received your invitation, Professor Kotsur, by the fact what you mentioned in the invitation, which has already been mentioned here at this table, what brings us together. And what keeps us together, certainly in the context of today, that, as you said, it's an existential question that is put on the table. And what keeps us together and what brings us together, and you already referred to it, there's, when we talk about the union of values, meaning freedom of the press, independent justice, respect for minorities, as you already mentioned, respect for human rights. And we have the tendency to take it, we as European citizens or as politicians or as a society, to take that for granted, that it is eternal, and achieved eternally. But that is most clearly not the case. So we have to take action to defend those values and what is really keeping us together and what is defining that European identity. And I think it's what you already referred, Professor, to what HRVP, High Representative Borrell, declared earlier today about the fact, what is happening now is a real violation of the basic principles of human coexistence. And it struck me also this morning, or it was at noon, indeed the initiative that has been taken by Commission President von der Leyen and President Michel of the European Council together at a press conference with NATO Chief Stoltenberg to make clear that the EU and NATO are really united at this particular moment, and when it has been the intention of the Kremlin, I won't say Russia, but the Kremlin, in order to divide the European Union and its allies, then indeed they have, as Commission President von der Leyen expressed today at that press conference, then they have achieved exactly the opposite, I think. And we hope, of course, to keep it as such. That's obliged me also to say and to repeat the words of Commission President von der Leyen that this is an unprecedented act of aggression against the sovereign state, against an independent country. And I think we all agree that Russia's target is not only to target the Donbass region or to target Ukraine, but Russia's intention is, we think, is to target the stability in Europe. And that's why it is so important that we show that unity among Europeans, and also, as was proven today, together with NATO. I think that the European Union now, and this is the bridge towards the Conference on the Future of Europe, that it is the task of the European Union now to show that in these dark moments that alliances, whether European Union, NATO, jointly, alliances that are built on trust, alliances that are built on democracy and our freedom, that we show that those alliances are resilient, also facing those existential threats. And if I can say a few words, but I'm open to questions, of course, on the Conference on the Future of Europe. That is exactly one of the main aims
Absolutely.
of that
This is
conference.
what we are really interested in. Take your time. We have plenty of time, and this is a key concern of this conference, and we are very happy to learn more about the conference.
Yeah, thanks for that, Professor. One of the main aims of that conference is indeed to ask citizens and to involve citizens and to put citizens, European citizens from all areas in the European Union, from all ages, gender equality, etc., to ask citizens what are your priorities for the upcoming month and years. What should the European Union really concentrate and focus on? Yeah. And it has been clear, based on the process that we've had since the 9th of May, 2021, and we are approaching the final phase of this conference, we hope by the 9th of May, 2022, in a few weeks, a few months. It has been made clear by citizens, but the final recommendations are not there yet. We have a new important moment next weekend, so from tomorrow onwards, and then the whole weekend. In the city of Dublin, 200 randomly selected citizens out of the panel of 800 will come together in Dublin to discuss important topics. But it has been made clear by citizens in the past weeks that their main priorities are of course climate, environment, also European democracy. Yeah. In other words, to strengthen the European project, to strengthen the decision-making project within the European Union. But I can imagine that in the upcoming weeks, in the upcoming days and weeks, that the European security architecture will come higher on that citizens' ladder of priorities. So it's not for me to decide, it's for the citizens to define those priorities and to put them forward. And then those priorities and those proposals, those recommendations of citizens have to be debated and discussed in plenary sessions. That has already happened 2 or 3 times, and the final recommendations of the citizens will be discussed and debated in the plenary together with elected politicians, together with members of the European Parliament, together with members of national parliament, together with civil society, together with members of the Council, the European Commission. So that's really the innovative aspect of that conference on the future of Europe. And the fact that we are discussing the future of Europe in these turbulent, dark circumstances makes it even more important that we ask citizens directly, 800 randomly selected citizens, ask them to focus on to ask them what should the European Union focus on. I think that the importance of that exercise has become even bigger, and we are looking forward, of course, to the final recommendations that will come out of those 4 European citizens panels, and that will feed into the plenary discussions with the ministers, with the commissioners, with the elected politicians of national and European parliaments. And we hope that, of course, that a solid report with concrete proposals, with tangible proposals will come out. And then, of course, it is up to the institutions. It's up to the European Commission to come with proposals. It's up to the European Parliament, up to the European Council to follow up, of course, and to make clear that what we promised in a solemn pledge to citizens in these important times, in a joint declaration on the 9th of May, 2021, by the 3 presidents of the 3 institutions, European Parliament, European Council and European Commission, a solemn commitment, a solemn engagement to follow up on what citizens are putting on our table. Yeah. That's also what makes this exercise of citizens' dialogues different from what we did in the past, because in recent years a lot of citizens' dialogues, of course, have been organized, and thousands of citizens from all over Europe were consulted on the future of Europe. But what makes this exercise on the Conference on the Future of Europe more innovative and unique, if I may say so, is the fact that there is that solemn commitment, that solemn engagement of the 3 presidents to really follow up with concrete proposals and to implement as much as possible the recommendations of the citizens into concrete policy making on all levels, on all policy levels. So we hope and we're looking forward to very concrete recommendations and proposals of citizens and towards the debates in the plenary.
Yeah, so are we. Thank you so much. Being taken serious as European citizen, I think this is the key word, and thank you very much for telling us a bit more about the structure of that conference and the future of Europe and the innovative part, because we very often have been discussing and debating and deliberating on the future of Europe, and I think this is really something very unique and special, and of course it takes place at a very unique and special time. I also am very grateful that you made a distinction when you were referring to the Ukraine question between the Kremlin and Putin and Russia, because I think this is not the same, and if you talk about blueprints, about dialogues and inclusiveness, as Professor Schröder did, I think it's very important to also keep that distinction in mind. It's not all citizens of Russia being responsible for what happens today, and I think that is a clear message that we also should send from this forum. Mrs. Möller, who are the we? I think you are in a particular position also to answer that question, or at least comment on that question, because you're working in a federal state where that famous unity in diversity is also displayed by our federal architecture, and I think you are quite experienced in questions reconciling a certain degree of diversity with a certain degree of unity. And I think that's quite a fragile balance that the European Union also has to deal with every day, and I think it's also key question, and Professor Schröder and Mr. Bellet made quite clear that we had a very strong statement of unity today, which is a very good signal and good sign, but the longer conflicts take, the more time passes by, the more fragile unity gets. And this is something which I'd like to ask you from your experience working in a federation, in a federal state. More unity, more diversity. Can one really reconcile unity and diversity for that? Who are we in Europe?
Thank you for this very important yet very big question. I think I'd like to respond in two steps. The first step is to underline what Ursula Schröder said, and also Ivo Bellet, that we have seen a lot of unity over the past days. Someone asked, I think it was you, Professor Kotzur, are we helpless? I don't think we are. And of course, I say this as a representative from a federal state that is not in charge of my country's foreign and security policy, because this has been dealt with at a different level. I just want to make this clear and put this forward, because we are part of the German Federation and the federal government is engaging in these things. And my sense has been, from our perspective of a federal state, of the Federal Republic, that there has been a lot of unity, because the aggression and the situation we are facing today is something that makes us, really challenges us on the one hand, but on the other hand, there has been preparation over the past years. Commissioner von der Leyen, Commission President von der Leyen and her commission have really thought a lot about questions and concepts of vulnerability and the opposite of the spectrum. I know Professor Schröder is working on this a lot, European sovereignty, where have we actually understand that there is vulnerability in the system, and how can we have a conversation about that and then act accordingly. And I think the fact that this conversation has happened, and I say this as someone who followed for almost 20 years in my previous role as an analyst, this conversation, there has been progress, and some of the right questions have been asked, and some of the remedies have been put into place, including the important link between the European Union and NATO. And we're seeing this today. And so why do I care about this? You might ask, as a representative from a federal state, because we are, of course, part of this European unity. My question, when you ask about the we, who is the we?
Who is the we?
I can give you the perspective of the Senate of Hamburg. We are part of the German Federation. We are, of course, a city and metropole region, and we are a member of the European Union. And all these arenas play a role for us. We want to contribute as a federal state. This is also a role that we are being guaranteed and asked for by the German Constitution, to the building and shaping of a cohesive European Union, a successful single market, everything that keeps us together as the European Union. And this is something that the federal states are doing actively, not least in the presence in the Conference on the Future of Europe, of course, where the Bundesrat has 2 representatives, which is very important for us. This is, in a way, I think, a period in European integration where we learn to engage in multiple arenas. And the perspective of the European Commission is a different one from the perspective of a German land or a French region, or, but we, I think, are understanding better, at least this is what I can say from my perspective, what it means to engage in this multi-layered and multi-level system. And in my role, this has nothing to do with me personally, but the role of the Bevollmächtigte of Hamburg is, on the one hand, supporting the First Mayor and the Senate in relations with the Bundesrat, so the legislation, the co-legislation that is happening in Berlin, and also the work that we are doing in our representation in Brussels, all the legislation that is coming through from the European Union through the Bundesrat, etc. And at the same time, of course, we have our arena here in Hamburg, where the regional parliament and the Senate engage and shape a lot of questions of increasing relevance for the EU collectively. And I think we are really in this very important phase. And if we wouldn't face the situation as it is today, we would probably be talking a lot more about how that then works on, finding a way to fight climate change and how to become innovation-based, forward-looking societies, that can be beacons of a new way of operating as, economies that is sustainable, etc. We would be talking about that a lot more today. It feels a bit distant to talk about that, but I want to talk about that briefly because it's a very concrete example of what you asked about the we. If engaging in my role in the field of climate protection, of course the European level plays a tremendously important role. Of course the national level does, because we have national legislation, and the regional level does as well. And what I observe with my background as an analyst, which is a lens sort of I put on probably here and there, that these different layers are going closer together. And I think this is a very, also partly because of the politicization of European integration and, a lot of fundamental questions that have been asked. And I think ultimately this is a very key development for the strengthening of the resilience of the European Union. And I feel this is a very important aspect that I understand is also being looked at in the Conference on the Future of Europe, which Hamburg engages in, and the Senate and colleagues with me today. We are, of course, happy that a lot of citizens and a lot of organizations here in Hamburg are also engaging in this. And for me, it is one of the key questions in the challenges that we are facing is how we can best exploit the potential we still have to truly work as a multi-level system. And this is, from my perspective, where I stand, a very concrete question and not a very abstract question, but I would be very interested to hear how this is being debated and looked at in the world of science, in the practical world. And this is really one element that I care about and where I see we are already making a lot of progress. So even in the dark moments today, I get, of course, optimism because this is what we have to.
Absolutely, we need that optimism, and I can assure you that multi-level thing and working together in multiple levels is something which is extremely intensively discussed in the sciences of European Union law, also public international law, public law in general. And I think you gave a very important keyword again, saying that we have to learn to engage in multiple arenas, Linzelle, and that brings me again back to you, engaging in multiple arenas and giving a voice to the citizens, what Ivo Bellet told us about the Conference on the Future of Europe. From your perspective, was it a strong voice that the citizens had in that conference? Was it helpful to learn to engage in more than the arenas than we usually do and we know very well? So has it been a successful progress in giving voice to us, the people of Europe, or is there still room and need for improvement?
Yeah, if I might add something on what Almut Möller just has said on the multiple layers, because from our organization, which basically is a organization of organizations, so members of the European movement are trade unions, companies, but also youth organizations, environmental organizations, so 250 organizations basically. And what we also always like to stress is the term, it's in Denmark is very strong in that the little democracy, probably I pronounce it horribly, I don't speak Danish, but it's the small democracy. And democracy is, of course, it's the high politics, it's the elected officials, but it's also the intermediate sphere of organizations, of representative organizations with democratic structures within, with decision-making processes, who then articulate their respective views. And I always find it very, still very interesting within the European movement that under our roof we have organizations that are far, far apart when you talk about sectoral policies, about the social pillar, for example, about the Green Deal, very much divergence here. But when we talk about the understanding of the importance of European integration, all those organizations have very similar expectations, and I think this is also very, very important if we talk about the arenas of political debate, that we don't forget there's something in between the citizens and the elected party political sphere. And when we then talk about the conference on the future of Europe, I think the really innovative thing were those European panels, so that were organized in a, you can't always be 100% representative, but where the aim was to have a representative a feature of the debates and of the citizens involved. And I think this is super interesting, and I just read some of the conclusions that have been published yet, and I think there, I always like to say that in many respects citizens are more progressive, not in a party political way, but generally more progressive when it comes to EU affairs than the high politics, because governments have a lot to lose when we talk about EU integration, their own sovereignty. And citizens often are more open to say, well, it doesn't make sense to have, for example, if we talk about Ukraine, to have unanimity when we decide sanctions. It makes us a lot weaker when just one state can say no, and then there's no decision. And this is something that for political representatives is hard to give in, because it's part of their sovereignty, but citizens understand, or I don't want to be say it in a general sense, but I think many people understand that if we want to be a sovereign Europe, if we want to be successful, we have to be more democratic. And democracy means that you have majority decisions, that you of course have an opposition and you have somebody who is in government. And this then translates to many of the proposals that have been made in the conference and by those representative panels, including rule of law, including media pluralism, something that are debated a lot in the high political sphere. And so I think these representative panels were very interesting. I'm hoping that their recommendations will be taken up by the plenary, will be discussed honestly by the plenary, and then, of course, the major step will be what comes out of it. So the best recommendations are void if there's no political process that follows, and this is the major challenge, and that got a lot harder from today, because political capital has its ends as well. We have many challenges ahead, and I'm very much afraid that this process, as important as it is, will somehow fall back down because it's not important enough. But of course, we and our sister organizations in Europe will try to that it happens otherwise, but yeah, I'm not super optimistic, to be honest.
Maybe there is no reason to be super optimistic, but I think it's very important work that you do. And before I get back to Ivo Bellet, I'd like to remind the audience that later on questions on your side are very welcome. Also, the audience back home is very welcome to raise questions via email. And I'd like to come back to you, Ivo Bellet, with one remark that just was made by Linzelle. Democracy is about, you know, majority voting, majority decision-making, deliberation. Both important things. My question would be, did in particular the Conference on the Future of Europe also address these issues, and would you be optimistic that it might help to improve the decision-making process in Europe? Because I think this is something which is also seen very critical by many of the citizens, critical also by the politicians, that there are kind of, you know, national interest, that there is the unanimity in many questions where, you know, actors such as Hungary and Poland, as we have been seeing in the past, can be not purely constructive, to put it mildly. And that would be my question. Is that also a meaningful instrument that we kind of reconsider decision-making processes within the European Union, maybe at the end of the day touching the treaties again and maybe changing the treaties? You have been talking about serious consequences, and the most serious consequences could be, you know, Lisbon plus, so to speak.
Yeah. Don't mention the beast.
No, I did it on purpose because I know you get it back in the cage, you know, the beast.
Yeah, it's out there already. So, yeah, so treaty change. So from a Commission point of view, we've always had, the Vice President has always said, yeah, we're not against treaty change. But as I said in my introduction, let the citizens speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are the citizens asking? What are the citizens putting on the table? And then, of course, we go, as Dr. Selle said, we have to go to the plenary and have the discussion on an equal level. Huh? So citizens, together with ministers, together with members of the Bundestag, the Bundesrat, etc., yeah, on a par, so as they say in Brussels, so on an equal level. So I'm very curious how those final recommendations of citizens will be discussed and what will come out. I'm not pessimistic. Optimism is a moral beauty. We don't have to be certainly today or after today or what will come up next in the upcoming hours. Of course, yeah, it's terrible, but nevertheless. We don't have to be, we shouldn't be naive, but I believe in that formal, in that solemn engagement by the presidents. Yeah, and I believe also in the fact that civil society, NGOs, not only the citizens, but das Mittenfeld, wie man auch sagt auf Deutsch, together with the elected politicians, of course, and the other stakeholders of the conference, that they will keep the pressure high. Yeah. Yeah. Even in difficult circumstances. Dr. Zeller referred to the unanimity rule that's existent with regard to fiscal affairs, foreign policy affairs, etc. The recommendations that are final, that came out of the last panel, the Maastricht panel of 10 days ago, which was about EU in the world, and which is, taking into account what happened today. The importance of these recommendations are increasing. Yeah. So I quote what citizens have put on the table, which has not been decided yet. It's the final recommendations of citizens that will go to the plenary and will have to be discussed with the elected politicians. I quote, citizens speaking, we recommend that the future joint armed forces of the European Union shall predominantly be used for self-defense purposes. So citizens explicitly refer to joint armed forces of the EU for defensive purposes. Yeah. And then in the next that was recommendation 23. Recommendation 24 that has been adopted by those 200 randomly selected citizens last weekend, at the panel in Maastricht, very recently. 24 says, we the citizens recommend that all issues decided by way of unanimity are changed to be decided by way of qualified majority. Full stop. Yeah. Okay, that doesn't mean that this will be decided, Professor, but it is on the table. The beast is out again, yeah. And taking into account circumstances that we are in, this, yeah, the urgency of this, yeah, is much bigger than yesterday, yeah. And when politicians elected representatives are confronted with this demand, with the support of all these citizens, and yeah, taking into account the circumstances, I think this is a very interesting debate. Pressure has to stay high from civil society, from European federalists, from all stakeholders, but nevertheless, it's an interesting process that we have started, and of course, we hope that we can implement proposals like this. Yeah. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, I know.
Yeah, Ursula Schröder, the beast is out of the cage, and are you surprised by the outcome that citizens really ask for, you know, that common defense union and also, you know, spending money for defense issues? I think that's a very interesting information that we just received, but I also would have a follow-up question. We have been talking also quite a lot about intermediaries, you know, that mediators between, you know, the citizens and political decision-making institutions. Sciences, to some extent, also do qualify in a certain sense as an intermediary. And I also wonder, you know, from your perspective, you know, what is the impact in particular of sciences in debates and discourses we have in the moment, looking at the Ukraine crisis and the war, which is not upcoming, but which already started, but also on the many other issues from your perspective. So that's a double question, you know, what you think about the citizen statements and, you know, how strong a voice got science in all these important debates.
These are, again, relevant questions. And to the first, this is a long-standing thing that European citizens are very supportive of the European foreign and security policy. If you look at the Eurostat surveys, you will find high approval rates for the question, do you envisage a larger role for CSDP as a common security and defense policy or others? I do find that surprising because security and defense policies are still clearly regulated at the national level, but it shows you also what citizens expect from the European Union, what the self-identification in Europe is, and what the role is that citizens ascribe to Europe. I see that as a good sign. I would say, let's have stronger security cooperation, let's have better peace policies, let's have better CSDP, common security and defense policies that are geared towards peace, not only European peace, but also international peace. We can all do with that. And if this is what is on the table, one can look for ways to go there. I mean, on many panels, I believe a panel also with Almut Möller, we've been asked about the future of the European armed forces, and the question has been posed many a time, and my answer has always been, this is not in the cards. There won't be federalized European armed forces because the command structure for that is very difficult to envisage at the moment, and we have NATO. But I don't think that's the core of the matter. I think the core of the matter is not the exact command hierarchy within a putative European army. The question is, what type of security do European citizens want, and how can we get there? And security is not only about defense, security is about security against the effect of the climate crisis. It's also security against intrusion of external powers into our territory, be that by digital means or cyber attacks, as we've seen in Ukraine today. It's also security in the old school language from fear and from want, if you look for the United Nations. So security is a big field, and I think the citizens of Europe are well advised to look for more security provided by the European Union. So in a sense, it's good. When it comes to the army, I'm more skeptical. But I can link that to the question on the role of academic research and science and knowledge transfer from academic research to policymaking. I think the role of academic research in advising peace, conflict and security policies is very high. But at the same time, the frustration of many peace researchers at the moment is also relatively high, because we've seen in Afghanistan last year the disastrously failed intervention in the Ukraine crisis. We see that quite a few of the statements that peace and conflict and security research has done for decades has not been heard. We know in research terms quite well how to come to effective negotiations. We have research on conflict transformation. We have research on whether sanctions work and under what conditions sanctions won't work. And there is in our community a sense of not being heard enough. And I think the blame is on both sides. I think we can do more to be heard. But I think policymakers also have to listen more closely to long-term implications. Because one of the challenges that we have is that our advice, our knowledge transfer tends to look at long-term developments. And as we see today, development on the ground, development in policy land are so fast that it's a different time scale. And the currency of our realm, if you like, is something else. The currency of our realm are ideas, it's expertise and analysis. And this usually, it takes longer to prepare, and it usually deals with longer time frames. So one has to bring the two worlds together, and at our institute we do that, and we struggle with that, but I think we have found a way to bring academic basic research and knowledge transfer together, but still there's the gap. And the gap is something that I think the Hamburg-Vigoni Forum can help to overcome, because here we bring really fundamental basic research from the law, from political science, from the social sciences together and try to look for ways out of the crisis in this particular dark hour. And I also think that the ramifications of research in questions of peace and security are there, because we do know quite a lot about issues like arms races, security dilemmas, whether or not a deterrence works. And these are questions that unfortunately have now moved to the front of the agenda again. And I think in this field we need a diversity of opinions, because as you know, it's a contested policy field. As peace researchers, we often disagree with more conservative security researchers. And I think this disagreement is very healthy, because we need contestation and disagreement on the core fundamentals of our security order to move forward. Because the core question will be about the future of the European security order, and I think for that we need civil society, we need the voice of civil society, and we need the voice of research, and we will see in the coming months how that plays out.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for mentioning two very important things for our forum. I think you just exactly addressed what this forum is all about. I think that's very important. And you mentioned the freedom from fear and freedom from want. Roosevelt's famous speech, also given in very dark hours. I think that also kind of encourages us to quote this today. I think is quite important. Almut Möller, that kind of, frustration that to some extent Ursula Schröder described, and also the need for urgent reactions, from a political perspective. Is that something that you also see in the European field, that we sometimes, consider and debate always in the long run and in the long term, and all of a sudden decisions need to be made immediately, and citizens tend to be disappointed because the outcome of the decision is maybe not to their kind of, improvement, and maybe they also kind of are concerned that the mechanisms are too slow. Is that something that, from a political experience, you'd also agree? Because, in sciences, and I quoted in German, you perfectly understand German, we have the experience, that famous quote that die Eule der Minerva erhebt sich zu ihrem Flug erst in der Dämmerung. We always come too late. We talk in the long run, all these big pictures, and then all of a sudden a decision needs to be made, and we are asked, where are you scientists? Where is there no blueprint? Your experience in that field, is that urgent decision making something which is very important to you, which is driving you?
Of course, we see today that urgency is very much there, and State Secretary Annen said there was no blueprint. But of course, we have a lot of experience as well in decision making, and the more experience there is also to decide collectively in a system that is the European Union, with all the levels of decision making involved. I think, urgency is something that should not be a threat. That should be something that, of course, needs to be dealt with from a perspective of policymakers, certainly. And as someone who analyzed for a long time very often the lack of ability of a European system to pull it off collectively, as I said, there is a learning process that policymakers at the different levels of decision making are making to engage in a Europeanized system. And that is something that takes time. But we're making progress with this. And this, I think, is important because then, and this sounds abstract, but it's very concrete, the learning space that we're going through collectively also helps us to develop mechanisms that then become, learned ways of collaborating with one another. Of course, it is very challenging having to engage in fields that are of existential nature, but this is the role of policy makers to then respond to that, and it was made very clear by the Chancellor today that this is being dealt with together with the partners in the European Union, in NATO, in the G7. But then stepping back a little bit and going back also to the question that you put to me about unity and diversity, and I didn't want to duck that. I had a slightly bit of a... but it's a very important one in this context as well. My sense is that we have had for a very long time an almost folkloristic understanding of diversity in the European Union.
Yeah.
It was always, of course, very important to put forward because it's a distinct feature. And I say this in a capacity of someone who analyzed this. I mean, this is a different field to the daily work I'm doing right now. But there was an almost folkloristic understanding of diversity. And we were proud of it. But then it suddenly became a problem politically because we realized there was a moment in the history of European integration where the inner fabric of European cohesion was put under pressure.
Yeah.
With movements that were not only critical of the European Union itself, but that were also very critical of, how to engage as liberal democracies. And I think this was a few years ago, a real learning moment, because it helped those who care about unity to identify more closely where do we absolutely need unity, what are the key questions that are fundamental to our unity, and that is why we're having a rule of law and a democracy debate in the European Union and a European Commission that put forward a mechanism which I think is very important to do it collectively also as member states. It's only one outcome of that, but there has been progress because we had to face that diversity is not something folkloristic. It can develop shades of destructiveness to the Union itself. And so I think this is another area where we've seen learning of the European Union system and where we have understood where diversity is not a problem at all. And I know many of you can be very clearly mapping out where this would be, and where unity is absolutely essential. And so we're coming to a new level of understanding of this. And maybe just one final point about the conference on the future of Europe. I think it was very important what Lynn Zelle said about who is the we, who is engaging and who is playing a role. Of course, with my perspective, I also want to say it's important that this is happening. And it is also at the same time, from our perspective here, a window of engaging citizens in something that is a lot bigger because it's a vehicle to talk about the Union in itself and to talk about how also on a daily basis, each and every one of us European citizens can be European citizens in the sense of, voting, participating as human beings, citizens of a European space, and it makes a difference. We do it at local level, it has a European relevance. We do it at national level, it has a European relevance. We do it at EU level when we're voting for the European Parliament. And I think it's also very important to keep that in mind, that it's an opportunity to engage with citizens on how they can exercise their rights as citizens in this space.
Absolutely. I could not agree more saying that diversity is something which needs to be organized and needs to be institutionalized. Otherwise, it's getting a bit dangerous. And that would be my question to Lynn Zeller. Would you agree that we in the past dealt diversity a bit too much in a folkloristic way, in the way that, you know, we always acclaim that united we stand, but we don't dare to really organize it? Is that also something you experience as, you know, as a civil society actor, that people and citizens exactly complain about, that diversity is something that they do not feel to be positive, but rather a kind of, you know, very, very, very dissonant voices, and not an organized management of diversity?
Well, this question has many levels. I think in the past years, what we have been, or well, tens of years, what we have been seeing is a normalization of the European Union as a political actor. I don't want to go into questions of statehood or whatever, but as a political actor, which has been in the 60s, 70s, 80s, still a project of governments. And today, and rightly so, it has become our aim, and based on the processes also de facto, more a vehicle or a project which involves citizens and which aims to have the consent also of citizens. And you don't have to go back to the Treaty of Lisbon and the failed referenda, but the consent of citizens has gained much more traction, and is, of course, if we want to talk about a project, a democratic project, we have to have this and we have to build on this. So I think this question of diversity also is normal if you talk about a political system which has a high level of federalism. I think Almut Möller can, when you talk about your work at the federal level, I think this is normal in Germany as well as being a federal state. You have different interests and you mediate them. You need the processes to do so. If you don't have the proper processes, then diversity gets out of hand. And I think this is also making the link to the conference very much important, that we have to think about the processes and have this discussion not only among the pro-European and the federalists who like to talk about institutions and the political scientists, but to really properly think about what, at the end of the day, what do we want to deliver and how we get there. Because also, well, I mentioned the question of qualified majority voting and the sanctions. It really determines the outcome of politics if you don't have the proper processes. And then maybe another aspect of diversity and this whole question of where do we grow apart from each other, or grew apart from each other in the past years. So we had this basic conflict on whether are we an economic union or are we a political union. And interestingly also, when we look at the last days, the events of the last days, I'm very curious how the next month will turn out, especially when we talk about countries like Poland, who have been very skeptical about many EU policies and well, you know, the rule of law debates. At the moment where this critical question of safety and security is concerned, a very critical question, especially for Poland, and to what extent this maybe changes the way Poland approaches also other EU policies in the light of these broader security concerns right at their own national border.
Thank you so much. I see time is running and we only have 15 minutes left, and I know that Almut Möller really needs to leave on time because she has plenty of other things to do. And therefore, I would like to give the last question, the last voice, to one member of the audience who is one of our students, and I greatly appreciate students' participation. I got that via email, and I think we all can discuss and debate the things tomorrow and please keep your questions in mind. But the student, I think, has a very interesting concern addressing what Ursula Schröder and Ivo Bellet said. And I'd like your comment, from your perspective on that interesting question. The student said he very much agrees and also applauds the united we stand feeling facing the foreign enemy. But he also is a bit afraid that could be dangerous too, because, the fear of the foreign enemy is also something which, autocratic states do. He critically asks, but does this new way to unify democratic alliances, especially the EU, pose a danger to their democratic basic values? And could it lead, at the end of the day, to more autocratic courses of action, especially in governments and regarding political agents, if we react to the foreign enemy and that brings us together? I think that is, of course, a very, very broad question, and we could now go back to Carl Schmitt. I definitely don't want to do, just to make that point quite clear. But I'm very happy to receive your comments on that, and I think that's a wonderful last remark for our panel. There would be much more open questions, but fortunately, in the program's workshop, we can continue tomorrow, so please keep them in mind. And we are looking very much forward to your final remarks, to that students, I think, quite important concern to some extent. Maybe Professor Schröder, you start and we do the line, and Linzelle will be the last speaker.
I tend to agree with the question, but the point is not fear.
Very important. Yeah.
It's not the question of whether we are united by fear against a common enemy. We know also from research that enemies obviously bring collectives together, and the dynamics that result from that can be exclusive. There can be negative dynamics. If you rally around the flag, as it's sometimes called in our field, then the result might be that you turn to an inward mentality that can then lead to less democracy and more authoritarian rule. This doesn't have to be the case, though. If we unite against a common adversary at this point in time, I think this is a good development, because within the European project we have certain values to defend, and we have to show that we are willing to defend these values. And I don't say that lightly or easily. And I think this has not so much to do with fear, but with carving out a space for the future outside a future of authoritarian regimes, because we have something really precious here. We have the most highly and densely institutionalized and cooperative field of states in the world. With the construct of the European Union, we have created something out of the ashes of a world war that looks for an equal still. And to defend this is a core move that has to be done today. I also talked about the need to be inclusive. I think the question is still on the table. European security cannot be done without Russia.
Yeah.
It has to be proceeded. We have to proceed in some, at the moment, distant future with discussions with Russia about the world that we live in. But at the moment, we are looking at defense, and we are looking at a way to defend values against an external adversary. And we need, to some extent, to bring our people together and to unify what we're looking at the moment. And then, in the long term, we see where we go from there.
Thank you so much. Also clarifying the term fear, which could be irritating. I think you made most important remarks. Ivo Bellet, your answer to the students' concern.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and Professor Schröder has given already excellent responses about that unity regarding the sanctions package, to make it concrete, to make it tangible, the sanctions package that is on the table now, and as we speak, you know that the European leaders will come together tonight in Brussels for an in-person meeting, if I'm not mistaken, to talk, to decide on the sanctions package that has been put on the table by the European Commission, and which was not decided, which perhaps will be decided today, but which has been prepared in previous weeks and months, of course, so it doesn't fall out of the sky all of a sudden. So there was, of course, that preparation by the European Commission. And I think we can say, in a side remark, the European Commission really has a tradition of involving and consulting the academic world and the think tank world very, very intensely, and then building on that expertise, and then of course come with a proposal that has to be put forward for the leaders like tonight. But I think that's such a response like today that people expect, and that we all expect, that it has to be robust, it has to be trustworthy, and that it's not easy to keep that unity when we talk about tangible sanctions. We talk about freezing assets of people. We talk about targeting the ability of the Russian Federation to have access to the capital markets. We talk about cutting off trade from member states of the European Union with the region that we talk about, with the Donbass region. So those are all very tangible measures that are put on the table, and then you can't allow to have too much diversity. Then you need unity, of course. Otherwise, you can't come to a conclusion. But to endorse what Professor Schröder has said, my final remark, I think that people, citizens, coming together tomorrow, again for the final European Citizens Panel in the framework of the conference in Dublin, that citizens, not only those 200, but citizens all over Europe now are very much aware of those values that characterize, defines our identity, what keeps us together. And to go back to my initial remarks, what we take for granted, what we took for granted, people know that it's not that obvious that we have those values, and I think that's also the case, I hope, for citizens in Poland and in Hungary, everywhere. They say, oh, there clearly is a difference between that model that is now promoted by the Kremlin and our model within the European Union, with all the diversity that is there. So I think that citizens realize more than ever since this morning, that those values can come under threat, and that we have to be ready to defend them in a robust way, not in an aggressive way, in a defensive way, but in a realistic way, so that other stakeholders in this turbulent world know that we are serious about it, about our ability and about our willingness to defend those values.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that there is a clear difference between an aggressive and a robust answer. How would you react to the students' concern, Almut Möller?
I think it's a very important question, and I've been thinking about it in that absolutely we need unity, but where does it emerge from, as both my previous speakers said? I'm more comfortable with really thinking that it doesn't emerge from othering and demarcation, but it emerges from the conviction, and you talked about future, I think, as an element, Ursula Schröder, is very important. It emerges from our own motivation to feel that what we create for us in our liberal democracies is our future, and that we can shape the challenges of the future in this way, and that might confront moments of really being challenged from the outside, but that should not be the main driver, because I don't think that would be sustainable for us. And if you look at the beginning of European integration, clearly that wasn't what was happening. Actually, it was the opposite. There was a threat that brought us all to the devastating situation in Europe, and there was an amazing moment of reinvention and really thinking about how we can shape. And I think Lynn Zelle talked about citizens wanting progressive, not in the political sense, but progressive ideas for the future of the European Union. That is, I think, what we need to trigger to give hope also beyond this dark day, to say there is a better future, because we have a lot in place in our system, in our wealth and ability to bring about that future. And then it comes from inside and not from a sense of othering, which I would ultimately consider dangerous, frankly.
Thank you very much. Othering, I think, is also a key word. That's something which might not unite us. Lynn Zelle.
Yeah, although I agree with what everyone said in response, and I don't want to be in the position to put water in the wine as the last speaker, but I might not be too optimistic, because if you look at the past 10, 15 years of European integration, it was always an external threat that enabled consensus, if you understand consensus in a broader way, decisions, reforms, and so on. So if you look at the financial and debt crisis, if you look at the corona pandemic most recently, and also now in the Ukraine crisis, we now have a consensus, and I'm very happy that it was able to have such swift measures. Probably also tonight more far-reaching measures will be decided. But I'm not so sure once the threat kind of gets more or becomes more normal, if it drags on in the next month, will it remain like that? And there I come back to what I said earlier about the processes. As long as we have this unanimity in foreign policy and sanctions decisions, it is, well, take the example of Cyprus blocking Belarus sanctions in last year because they want a more strengthened European Union on EU-Turkey relations. So we need the processes. And at the moment, we need external threats in the broadest sense of the word to forge consensus and to bring the European Union forward. And that last sentence was or is still my hope of the conference on the future of Europe, that this makes it different, that we have what Ivo Bellet said before, that we have the three institutions together, solemnly swearing this exercise, making it different, to having a consensus without this external threat that in the past 15 years was needed to have or to make far-reaching policy decisions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our four excellent speakers. We, of course, could not replace the speech by President Levits, but I think we made something out of that evening, and with thanks to you, because you gave wonderful comments and insights and quite a lot of food for thought that we need to discuss tomorrow and in the follow-up sessions of that Hamburg-Vigoni Forum, which will continue for another couple of years. And I would greatly appreciate if we would be able and allowed to come back to you and to have you on board at least once in a while, because it was excellent and most enlightening contributions. Meine Damen und Herren, lassen Sie mich auf Deutsch schließen. Ich danke allen noch einmal ganz, ganz herzlich. Und viel zu viele Konferenzen im Europarecht sind schon mit einem Hölderlin-Zitat beendet worden. Ich weiß, es ist furchtbar abgedroschen, aber ich tue es trotzdem, weil es passt. Wo die Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. Wollen wir es hoffen. Guten Abend. 1000 Dank.
Der Rettungsanker in schweren Zeiten.